Welcome, everyone, to the Policy's Role in Facilitating the Energy Transition panel. We are bringing together passionate experts to discuss how governments and organizations can collaborate to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy sources, encourage energy efficiency, and promote an equitable, low-carbon future. This four-person panel discussion will be moderated by Jackson Ewing, the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Nicholas Institute of Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. Our four panelists are Raul Alfaro-Pelico, Senior Program Director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, Sandra Henry, President and CEO at Slipstream, Katharine Kollins, President of the Southeastern Wind Coalition, and last but not least, Mandy Meadors, Public Policy Director at Deriva Energy. We're very excited about the discussion, and we hope you are too. Keep your questions in mind, and feel free to submit them to Slido via the QR code on the screen behind me. Thanks, and let's get started. I'll pass it over to Jackson and our panelists, and let's go ahead and give them a warm round of applause as they make their way to the stage.
Thank you, Uza. Thank you to you and Jose and the rest of the team that's put together this panel. It's a real privilege to be able to moderate it. Let's dive right in. I want to start with you, Mandy. Getting intermittent renewables from the places where they're produced to the consumers that need that energy is a really complex task, and it's one that's been changing markedly over the last decade. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that transmission is playing in that equation, how that's shifting, and how it can be improved moving forward?
Absolutely. So transmission policy is basically what everybody's talking about now when you're talking about the energy transition. And probably the two takeaways that you need today is the first is, one, we need a new car. And I'll explain what that is. So the transmission grid as it stands now is kind of like the car that you've paid off and you've been driving for a while. And you start making some repairs get more expensive, you start making more repairs, and then it gets to the point where you're spending about a car payment a month on making repairs, and you think, okay, well, now I've got to get a new car, so I've got to come up with more money. And that's the transmission grid today. The transmission grid is 100, 60, 70, 80, sometimes 100, depending on where you are in the country, years old, and it needs a lot of repair, it needs a lot of maintenance, and frankly, we need new stuff. So how to change that is very difficult, and what's going to have to happen is utilities have to be either incentivized or given a mandate. And then they have to work with regulators and legislators to figure it out, and they have to be proactive about it. It can't be. It's almost like the net metering issue. Utilities went so long just saying, nope, we're not doing net metering. Nope, we're not doing net metering. That we can't do that with the transmission grid. We're never going to get to the energy transition without it. And until utilities and regulators and legislators come together and figure out what is going to work, that's not going to happen, and it's going to keep delaying that energy transition. The second part of it is the education that the bill has now come due. And the education has to start with ratepayers and constituents and legislators and regulators, and it's something that utilities have not been saying. They have not been saying, okay, the bill has come due, we need a new car, and we have to figure out how we're going to pay for this. And so your transmission rates may go up, and your electric bill may go up. And then work with legislators and regulators. How do we keep that rate? How do we get what we need, ensure reliability, but also keep the cost affordable to Americans or ratepayers? That's essentially what has to happen. It's an enormous task, but that's what the challenge we're facing today.
I want to grab onto one thing you said there, which is that we have to build new stuff. As we build new stuff, we have to site that, we have to permit it, and that brings you into a litany of different regulatory processes and different sorts of engagement that's necessary for the communities that are going to be affected. I wonder if you can say a bit about how those processes are playing out in renewable energy development and transmission today.
Oh, goodness. So
you could do that in the next few minutes, right?
how much time do I have again?
Yeah.
How long is this panel? So this question is really indicative of where the policy is shifting for renewable energy and renewable energy developers. So I would say 8 years ago when I entered the renewable energy policy space, the main drivers were corporate buyers and RPSs. Flash forward 8 years, the IRA has passed, and where it's now state, but really the battle is local. And unfortunately, because of today's polarized politics, renewable energy has become a woke issue in very rural areas, and we're seeing a lot of backlash. And what this does to development is just extend timelines, because now where permitting and siting was almost a given in the development timeline, it's not now. It's now having to, I keep telling my development team, whatever timeline you have, add 6 months to a year to it, because that's what you're going to need, because you're going to have to get in with the local elected officials. You're going to have to make those relationships. You're going to have somebody on the ground long term to keep that relationship going and pass it off as new elected officials come in, make sure that relationship is consistent. And it's an investment in not only policy but relationships, and that's something that renewable developers really haven't had to do in the past.
Thanks so much, Mandy. We're going to come back to a lot of that, and please go ahead and begin submitting your questions through Slido at any point in our conversation. But I think you've teed up things for Katharine quite well, and in that I mean Mandy's just laid out that we're seeing expansions in timeline and we're seeing higher costs. And nowhere is this more top of mind, perhaps, in the wind sector, where it seems like every week we're hearing about another deal fall through and shaky outcomes on what we thought were solid power purchase agreements, et cetera. So what do we need to know about this current moment in wind? And in particular, how are these factors playing out in the Southeast?
Yes, well, there is a lot of excitement in, I'll speak specifically to the offshore industry right now, I guess we'll hone it in a little bit. So for those of you who don't follow the offshore wind industry all day, every day, there have been a number of announcements. President Biden had a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, and a lot of the development community, as well as NGOs, were very excited about working hard to meet that goal. There are a number of PPAs that were signed in northeastern states. These PPAs were signed, though, prior to COVID, and so frankly, prior to a lot of the inflation and supply chain issues that have been plaguing the industry as of late. So just to bring that back to the Southeast, and how does that affect us in the Southeast? In some ways, we are fortunate, right? We, in the Southeast, haven't necessarily been first movers in the offshore industry. It was always, let's let the Northeast sign those PPAs, let's let them, work through some of these supply chain issues. Right now, all of the products, all of the components are manufactured in Europe and Asia, where there is a lot of development. And so the idea has been, well, we need to bring this manufacturing powerhouse to the United States, primarily to the East Coast, where we've got these development contracts. One of the really interesting things that we've seen with that is that the technology evolution within the offshore industry has been rapid. So of the tiny little pilot projects that are currently installed in the US, those turbines are spinning at 6 megawatts per turbine, right? The turbines that we're about to install in Virginia, 14 megawatts. The turbines that are contracted for those Northeast projects are in the 16 plus megawatt range. And so what's happening is the OEMs are having trouble keeping pace with that, right? They first said, okay, well, we're gonna build an entire supply chain around 12 megawatts or 6 megawatts, and now scrap that supply chain. We've gotta build a supply chain around 12, now 14. And so there needs to be, we need this period of catch up before the supply chain can really meet the demand that we are seeing for a lot of these states. So in terms of the Southeast has no PPAs signed. My organization advocates from Virginia down to Florida and over to Louisiana. And so I'll speak specifically to Virginia, where there is some good news. The Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project that was put into place through policy that was enacted by the state of Virginia a couple of years ago. And that project is 2,400 megawatts, 2,600? I always get it mixed up. It's a very large project that is being built by the regulated utility. And they just announced the other day, so they started signing contracts really during COVID for a lot of their manufacturing, for their turbines, for their construction services. And so they had their prices established after the majority of inflation on things like steel and those types of things had already been baked in. And so that project just announced this week, right after Ørsted pulled out of a couple of Northeast projects completely. CVOW just announced that their project was originally estimated to be between $80 and $90 a megawatt hour for LCOE, and they are now estimating $77 a megawatt hour. So truly competitive costs for a generating technology that is going to have a huge positive impact to the grid, bring a lot of new jobs and development to the state of Virginia and North Carolina. And so I think we find ourselves in a much more positive position there.
Fantastic. At risk of moving from such a positive story back to the negative, I do want to ask you about some of the other barriers that you see the wind industry facing in the Southeast, but also more broadly outside of these supply chain, inflation, and cost issues. What of siting and permitting? What of biodiversity concerns? How do you see the shape of local opposition, community level opposition, and are there things we can learn from Virginia or other examples about how to overcome those?
Yeah, well, I will start with the title of this panel, policy. Policy is always going to be the most important component to making an offshore wind energy project work. You need policy, and it can't just be at the federal level. You need state level policy. That is what we have seen up and down the East Coast. It is the reason that we don't have any projects established in North Carolina. We have lease areas. We've got projects that are attempting to move through the development process, but none of those have been contracted for, and therefore none of those could start construction. That said, we do hear a lot about, I think in the news media and whatnot, you do hear a lot about things like biodiversity concerns or NIMBY concerns, people not wanting to see these projects from shore, that kind of thing. We've done a lot of polling as well as looked through a number of other polls that other organizations have conducted. And by far and away, those issues are outsized both in the media and in the influential people who can bring those things to light. So you think about, how many coastal homeowners are there? Not very many, very, very few, but you know what? They are all well connected. They all vote. They all give money to their local elected officials and their state elected officials and their federal elected officials. They have money to give, and so they've got outsized voices. That is something I always try to hammer home because it's a little frustrating. So with that, I will say that policy is by far and away the most important thing. North Carolina, I'll just use this as my excuse to talk a little bit about North Carolina and what we need to see here. What can we learn? We can learn that if we want to see offshore wind developed, which is the only true path to decarbonization for the state of North Carolina, you need offshore wind in that generating mix in order to truly decarbonize. We have some policy at the state level, but now it is in the hands of Duke Energy and the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And so what's the current state is Duke is a little bit soft on just how hard they're willing to fight for offshore wind. They've got an offshore wind energy lease, their unregulated affiliate does, and you would think that they've got every incentive to really make sure this works, but there's also that need to bring the Utilities Commission along as well. And so I think they're kind of waiting to see, looking for signals from the Utilities Commission, looking for signals from customers, from developers, et cetera. So that's really what's needed there is kind of that final push to ensure that utility regulators in North Carolina can and will advocate for offshore wind to be part of the state's generating mix.
Yeah, certainly difficult to overstate the importance of state utility regulators in all these decisions that we're talking about here today, and not just in North Carolina. I'm glad that you landed on policy as kind of the central thesis in answering that question, because that's where we're going to go with our next panelist and hearing from Sandra. Sandra, Slipstream has a really comprehensive portfolio on helping stakeholders equitably develop and pursue decarbonization. I want to hit on two of them here. The first part is finance, and I want to ask you how you see some of the new federal legislation, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act, the bilateral infrastructure law, and anything else you would like to pick up on as affecting finance for decarbonization, and doing so not just through those federal policies themselves, but how they're filtering down to state and local levels as well.
Sure. So I want to just focus in on the decarb piece for a minute, because Slipstream focuses specifically, well, in general, around building decarbonization. And that has a lot of meanings for folks. I just want to define it for us today. When I say decarb, I'm thinking about a building, and the goal is to make it as efficient as possible first. Efficiency first is a non-starter. Then take out fossil fuel burning equipment as much as possible and replace it with electric options. Next would be connect to renewable energy. And then the following step would be to make sure that we're managing the load so we don't overburden our existing or growing transmission and distribution systems. So all four of those pieces are really, really important. And policy has a role to play at every one of those levels. So flipping to finance as it relates to building decarb, very excited about the funding that's coming down. I mean, this is like once in a lifetime opportunity for us to really advance decarb and efficiency and sustainability in a way that we've never seen before. I've been in the industry for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. So on the finance side, what I see is a lot of activity around establishing green banks across the country and regions. In particular, Wisconsin is setting up a commission. Right now, I'm a commissioner to help them create the framework for the green bank. And some of the recurring themes as we go out and talk with stakeholders and other folks within the state, there's a real concern that any green bank is going to struggle in financing the smaller projects. And that has an equity lens as well, because we're talking about smaller businesses, maybe homeowners or building owners that can't afford full building decarb. The data point I'm using is it's probably between $60,000 and $70,000 to fully decarbonize and electrify a unit of housing. So when you think about it in that context, it's not affordable for many. And there is a growing concern that the green banks are going to struggle at how to finance those smaller projects. On the flip side, it's exciting because in Wisconsin, I'll use that as our example, there's a lot of excitement around renewable energy and solar and other renewable options that I don't think has ever really existed in the state before. So it's igniting a lot of really exciting conversations. I'm hopeful that we'll get to a green bank solution that will provide financing for everyone's projects. Another thing that's interesting in the Midwest and probably elsewhere in other states is there's this focus on urban areas and rural. And sometimes we forget that the needs might be different based on the community that we're living in or talking about. So I think that's important to have a global view of how financing can help implement all the projects. The other piece that's exciting is CPACE is getting more funding as well. And Slipstream runs CPACE programs in multiple states. So we're excited to see that grow even more over the next 3 to 5 years, which is another really great financing tool. That needs more attention and marketing, and we want more people to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Thanks much. I appreciate your emphasis on green banks. We were fortunate to be able to host yesterday evening a Duke alum, former Duke employee, now head of the North Carolina Clean Energy Fund, who did detail many of these challenges that you've laid out nationally in the North Carolina context, and you're certainly seeing things in the same way. The second part of the Slipstream portfolio that I wanted to ask you about is on education and training. So in our work here at Duke, many of the companies that we're talking to about decarbonization are quick to bring up that they need better pipelines for skilled labor. And they need forward thinking about what the skill and labor needs are, and they need strong partnerships with community colleges, with technical training programs, et cetera. So how do you see these challenges, and what do you view as some of the key principles to addressing them?
Another big, broad challenge. So I have I'll share a couple of stories. One is I had an opportunity to be a part of a group called Advanced Energy Group. If you don't know about them, you should Google it and join and support the effort. And there was a cohort we put together to really focus in on how do we get students younger than folks in this room excited about clean energy jobs. And we found it was really hard to think about how to help students see themselves in those roles. They don't have any idea what the job looks like. When we say clean energy job, what is that? And so we spent a year trying to translate those different positions into videos and other communication strategies that the students could see and actually see themselves in it. I think that's really important. So that's one story. The second story I think I would share is in Illinois. I'm from Chicago. There was a big bill, the CEJA, Clean Energy Jobs Act, that was passed a couple years ago. And it had a very large workforce component. And it's been a challenge to implement it because we need unions to help us. We need our community-based educators to help us with that. And there's also a need to communicate with our skilled laborers that this is an opportunity for them and this is a way to expand their skill sets. I think the other piece that gets lost in our workforce development conversations is the focus on contractors, existing contractors that may have adjacent businesses. Maybe they're a plumber or an electrician, but no one's really had a conversation with them about here's an opportunity for you in the clean energy world, and here's how your skill sets would directly translate to working in that area. I think there's a lot of education and conversation that needs to happen. And then for contractors that are just starting off their businesses, we realize that we really need to wrap our arms around them. They need support. They often might be an office of one. They don't have a secretary or an admin assistant, so we need to figure out how we can help them with that back office piece. And then also help them get certified in all the different, MeBe, Weebie, all the alphabets, which takes time and money. And often the contractors don't see that, and they need help and support in getting there.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for such tangible examples of the transition in action and what's needed there, and also for providing clear resource to our students here about how they can see themselves in clean energy jobs. We'd love to hear some student reactions to that when we get to the conversation in a moment. It also strikes me that you tee up Raul quite well, because Raul, you're going to help us look beyond our borders here into international decarbonization and energy transition efforts, including on this sort of skilled labor and professional development fronts that Sandra has just laid out. So to start with, will you please just tell us about the Energy Transition Academy that you lead with RMI and what you're doing on that front?
Thank you so much, Jackson. And first of all, I want to thank all the organizers for this amazing day. I really know that there's a lot of work in the background to make this happen. So really kudos to you all for the great organization. And really enthusiastic about the panels and the conversations taking place. The keynote discussion earlier, as well as the opening remarks, were amazing. And I'm just fortunate to be joined by these panelists who have touched on a couple of things that I think are critical. We've talked about policy and also projects. You need to see the real stuff happening, right? Now, there is a third ingredient that oftentimes is not spoken about, which is people, right? And I think Sandra has touched on it already. Internationally, how this looks like, more than internationally, globally, the way it looks like is, I don't know if anybody follows this renewable energy jobs report that IRENA publishes every year. They've been publishing that for a decade now, together with the International Labour Organization. The last report came out a few weeks back, and it said that renewable energy jobs have risen to 13 million last year, which is great. About 10 years ago, it was about 5 million jobs in the renewable energy sector, so that's a significant increase. However, it's not enough if we are really to meet the decarbonization goals of the mid-century, and that means we need to create 30 million jobs by 2030, in about 6 years. So the current pace is not fast enough, and I think there's an element of that I think is important to unpack. I mean, first you need people equipped, skilled, already to embark on the renewable energy sector. Half of those jobs, as Sandra alluded to, they just need to be transitioned, right? And I'm talking about 30 million jobs globally. 60 million of those need to be just reskill or upskill. So there's people already with some, parallel skills that can be easily transitioned, and that shouldn't be so hard. Now, there's the other half, which are jobs that we don't know today, right? I think in the previous sessions, we've seen how technologies have evolved. Some of those jobs do not exist today. We don't know what they are. And so it also requires significant investment in research and development, and also just being ready for what might be that next breakthrough. So I think that poses a significant question in the role of people and how policy can enable workforce development and skilling and all that. And that's one of the things that the Energy Transition Academy does at Rocky Mountain Institute. It's called Academy because there is education taking place, but it's by no means meant to be theoretical. It's meant to be really know-how, hands-on focus. That is especially relevant in the developing world because there are many countries with challenges in education. Not everybody has, the same educational base that the U.S. has, but still we have the need for investing in skills. And it turns out that actually that can be a great accelerator of the energy transition because if you think about places like in Africa, Africa has the continent that will have half of the world's youth in a few years. And many of those people may not actually have a degree, but they still can have certain skills without even having a certificate that can immediately be deployed. And so the benefits are massive. If you think about the benefits of investing in clean energy, some studies have clearly said that for every $1 million of investment in clean energy, you can generate about 7 jobs. With fossil fuels, you only generate 2 or 3 jobs. So that's already a significant potential. But I'd like to touch also on something that Sandra mentioned, which is really dear to my heart, which is the justice and equity side of it. Women, for example. The last report from IRENA shows that 40% of women are already part of the workforce in the clean energy sector. That actually contrasts with 20% in the fossil fuel and is growing. And so there's a significant potential for gender parity by investing in solar, wind, and other technologies, and with that, really addressing the gender gap, but also the youth, much engagement of the youth in this technology. So the Energy Transition Academy, as well as other efforts worldwide on skills are really important because I don't think they're getting enough attention. It's not just focused on universities, but it also includes universities. It also focuses on vocational training. It focuses on the job experience that we really need to invest in order to really bridge that gap of renewable energy jobs.
Thanks, Raul. I want to use my final question here to touch on something that you and I have worked together on, as well as our colleagues here at Duke and at RMI, which is one of the core impediments to getting clean energy projects off the ground in low and middle income countries, and that is risk, both real and perceived risk. And you all have done some really fascinating and important work on how we can de-risk clean energy projects in emerging markets. So with our final few moments before we open up to the discussion, can you give us a little more color on what those risk calculations look like and what some of the tools for de-risking are that you have seen to be successful?
Great question. Well, I've been thinking about this risk and the risking issue for the past 10 years when I was working in the United Nations. And at the time, and it's still relevant today, we distinguish two types of de-risking mechanisms, policy instruments and then financial instruments. I think a lot of the conversation today is very much focused on the policy de-risking because I think where policy is really important is in addressing the underlying barriers to investment. And oftentimes those are everything that, my fellow panelists have talked about. Lack of permitting, how long it takes, some of the basics that need to be really addressed. I think there's an element of that is actually, you touched on perceived risk, is about attitudes towards risk. We have all different risk profiles. We are risk takers or risk avoiders. That's just human behavior. And a lot of that has to do with confidence. I think the example earlier about, the utility here in North Carolina, as well as the developer is it's almost like a, excuse me, sort of like a game theory, who takes the first action. That's all human behavior. And I think a lot of that has to do with addressing those underlying barriers. Now, there's another aspect of de-risking, which is financial instruments. And again, we always think about, okay, we just need to pour lots of money in venture capital or other technologies to make the breakthrough. But in fact, it's all about shifting where the risk lies. And financial instruments that allow for that shift risking include results-based financing approaches. Some of those have been piloted in the developing world, but I think they're quite relevant here in the US and OECD economies, which is to actually find incentives so that people actually can take risks. And so we've studied how and in many ways how the risk perception and translated into the cost of capital can be reduced by 5% or more if you address those sort of behavioral aspects of the risks.
Thanks much. And thanks to all the panel members for such an insightful start to the conversation. We have a number of really compelling questions. I'm going to apologize in advance to all those who have submitted questions that we won't get to. Really excellent stuff here, and impossible for me to truly draw any kinds of themes together, but I'll try anyway, at least crudely. And that is that many of our questions are speaking to the intersection of public policy and the private sector, and many of our questions are also speaking to environmental justice and marginalized communities. I want to call out one question that seems to capture a lot of that in one very broad place, and I want to begin here with you, Mandy, as a representative from private sector experience. And that is to say, and I'd love to hear from each panel member on this, how can policy create incentives for the private sector to ensure that the transition to clean energy is just and does not sacrifice marginalized communities?
Wow. I do not have a short answer to that at all. That is probably what we deal with every day. And I mean, then you get into the question of, is it federal? Is it state? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to ensure that those private companies are, holding up their end of the bargain? I wish there was. I mean, I really wish. Being a pure play developer, I wish there was a really easy. Well, it's this incentive. That's what we need. Certainly, tax credits work, but how those tax credits work, because not all of them work the same, impacts every project that we do. So they have to make sense. I think they have to make sense for the developer and the project. I think the bottom line is we have to start looking at it, and I hate this corporate word, but I'm going to use it, holistically. Can't believe I just used it. We have to look at it not as, okay, we need to go build new clean energy. And then we also need to do this environmental justice. And then we also need to, get affordable housing in the mix too. Like this is a whole, I think, the energy transition is not just clean energy. It's not just environmental justice. And there's so many people working on facets, and basically we're all siloed. And until we all come together and look at it as a big piece, like almost as a huge whiteboard, and whiteboard out everything that everybody's doing, and then how does one complement the other, and how can we all move in the same direction rather than in 5 different. I don't know if there's an answer. I mean, maybe Katharine can be like, yeah, it's that one, but I'll hand that hot potato off to her.
All right, go for it, Katharine.
Ouch,
We're
thanks.
counting on you.
No, it's a great question, very interesting. My team does an internal discussion every 2 weeks on various topics that somebody on the team picks, and actually yesterday, the topic was Justice 40. And just within my team, there's such an interesting array of perspectives. I mean, I'll say with Mandy, I don't think there is one thing, but I'll speak to something that we talked about yesterday that I found to be very interesting, and that is, with Justice 40, does it become overly politicized, in especially the clean energy circles where you do have often a more liberal leaning set of folks who say, yes, this is what we absolutely have to do. For me specifically, I work across the southeastern states, which we work with a lot of conservative legislators, a lot of conservative governors, and when you start talking about things like Justice 40, it like immediately can shut some people down. And so thinking through how do you get to, I mean, it goes back to the holistic thing, right? Like what's your end goal? And depending on where you're working, I think that the approaches, the tactics, the policy that you take have to be very different. Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, I don't think that there is one good answer.
I'm glad you located us geographically there a bit, Katharine, because Sandra, you have experiences in our largest, most important Midwest municipality on this issue, and I'm sure that there are similarities but also differences there. So how do you see this playing out in your work?
Well, what Mandy and Katharine just shared, I think are common themes. We're all talking about similar challenges. I've had an opportunity to sit with a group called Just Transition Power Force that is housed in the Emerald Cities Collaborative. And one of our tasks was to really talk about and brainstorm around does the intersection between a private sector developer and a community that wants solar or is a great spot for solar, how does that interaction happen? And a years-long conversation that's still continuing, some of the things that we discussed was the importance of talking to the community, not the community representatives, but the community as a whole. So while you might be compelled to talk to the aldermen or the local legislators, that's totally fine, but go talk to the people that your project will ultimately impact, and be curious and walk in to the room or wherever you happen to be meeting with a mindset of you're here to learn and listen, that you're not coming with a packaged solution that you're just going to drop on the community. And think about how to co-create that together, as opposed to, you do your project and walk away. I think there's also, and this is my opinion, my desire would be that we approach it in a way that we're having a long-term relationship with community. How do we want to help? How do we leave it? How do we continue to support them after the project is done? I think that is that is what I would like the intersection to look like.
Thank you. Raul, the scale of this question for the broader low and middle income country context is enormous and also unique, country to country, community to community. What kind of broad thoughts do you have on this question of equity for marginalized or underserved peoples in developing countries as part of the energy transition?
Huge question. So, but I will say, if this is encouraging, that there's a lot of parallels between some of the things that are happening here in the US and what needs to happen internationally. And that doesn't mean copying and pasting, but it actually means drawing parallels. So I'm just thinking about, coal mining communities in West Virginia who are probably also thinking about, what is in it, the energy transition for me, if I'm going to be losing my, my jobs or my livelihoods or my, welfare. Those are the same questions that communities in Indonesia or Vietnam are asking themselves. And, if you heard Tom's session earlier, 70% of emissions are going to happen in the Global South. So when you bring this conversation to the Global South, there isn't even like red or blue states, there is more like justice, right? So, OECD economies polluted the world, we have the right to do the same, right? And so it becomes even a more complex question. It turns out that, to Sandra's last point, that the same community approach actually works, but it's only when you do engage the community really fully and rather less hierarchical, as she said, but more like, really grassroots level. It is a little bit more than just nice thing to do or social stuff to do to address justice. When you're thinking about a country like Vietnam, who is thinking about their just energy transition package, one of those policies that you've heard about over the past years, some of them have happened in South Africa, Indonesia, there's some in Senegal that is in the works. Vietnam is still hesitating about it, but what Vietnam is doing is, first of all, is massively investing in renewable energy, particularly solar energy, and with that, ramping up employment and employing its people, even though they still keep some of the coal. So I think there's a lot of discussion around trade-offs between one and the other, and I think that's just a distraction, because at the end of the day, if you think about China, China is massively investing in clean energy while we're debating about climate justice and whether we should leave that stuff on the ground. Same thing other countries are doing. And so if you think about Vietnam, who has all this massive coal, they're not just investing in renewable energy, but they're also one of the largest creators of employment in the world. In that IRENA report that I referred to, Vietnam shows us, not just as one of the countries that are creating more renewable energy jobs, but also is one of the countries that are top in terms of manufacturing solar panels. And I think this is where, thinking about policy, we need to really think holistically, I think, because this is not about energy policy only. It's about education policy, industrial policy. You have to think about all the policies as a whole to realize that, in fact, when you engage a community, there are actually more benefits than you can or you cannot do coal. If you make it binary, then you lose the conversation. Whereas if you're thinking about what a community like in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Nigeria or in the Caribbean can benefit from, having some of the local manufacturing domestically, then the conversation changes. And I think because we failed to bring the entire, broad discussion, then that we start taking sides.
Sure. And what you bring up also highlights the temporal element here, which I think Vietnam provides a good example of for other countries that are looking to transition their economy. Rather than starting with coal retirements, start with the build out and opportunities that come with the build out of the renewables sector and the attendant manufacturing jobs and kind of virtuous carry-on effects that arise, and then talk about coal phase out, right? Instead of coming with the hammer first off. We have several questions that I think do a good job of a deficit in my own questions and approach to the panel, which is trying to marry the domestic and the international. So we have questions around how we can enforce policies when U.S. companies are developing, drilling, and producing in other emerging markets, and perhaps that could undermine some of the policies that or the progress that they are compelled to make at home. We have questions that are more targeted towards things like the Jones Act. I'm going to add domestic content provisions myself in the Inflation Reduction Act that are trying to onshore or friendshore some of our operations, and creates questions around, where we place the priority there on decarbonization versus domestic industrial policy. So, Katharine, I think you've spoken most directly about supply chains so far. So can you get us started? And I'd welcome any responses from any other panelists as well about how we can balance those supply chain questions between our domestic goals and our need to continue to leverage the powers of globalization for lower costs and for opportunities in other countries, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm happy to attempt a response to that. So within the offshore wind industry, a number of states that I mentioned, especially up in the Northeast, tied offshore wind PPAs to local content provisions. They effectively said, well, if we're going to give you a price premium for offshore wind, we want to make sure that we get the local economic development here. This is, we're talking about over $100 billion of economic investment that will be put into the supply chain. So states rightfully are saying, well, we want to make sure that we get part of that. You couple that with the IRA and the that added federal incentives for both for local domestic for domestic content, not necessarily local, but domestic content within, especially with regard to steel. And then also domestic content and incentives for manufacturers to, again, start building those plants here in the U.S. But when you couple that with the uncertainty around the kind of technology evolution that I was talking about, it just becomes, we add a couple of additional layers that maybe the industry isn't quite ready to bear in terms of local content. And so I think certainly what the offshore industry right now is asking for is talking to the White House in terms of IRA implementation and asking for a phased-in approach. So again, it's that, hey, we know that we want to bring, that we need to bring the supply chain into the domestic sphere. However, it's really important for us, if we want to get these projects off the ground, we want to build the workforce, that we have to allow international components to be utilized as much as possible in those first few projects. And for whoever asked about the Jones Act, clearly somebody follows offshore wind.
Could you explain for our audience what the Jones Act is?
More closely than most.
Yeah.
Sure. If you want to be really bored.
Oh, I don't think, no, come on.
Okay, all right, the Jones Act. The Jones Act is, it's really about shipping, and it was enacted many, many years ago to ensure, most countries have something like the Jones Act, but effectively it says, we want to make sure that we have our own shipbuilding capacity. It's really like a wartime kind of mechanism to make sure that we would never be entirely reliant on some other country's ability to build ships. And so it says, if you want to move goods from one U.S. port to another, you must use a U.S. built and flagged vessel. I could get into what the repercussions for offshore wind. They are significant because the U.S. does not have flagged, U.S. built and flagged vessels to install offshore wind projects. If you ever, one of the coolest things that you can ever look at if you're, if you're kind of an energy nerd, which I assume all of you are, is the ships used to install offshore wind are incredible vessels. There is one under construction in the U.S. right now that Dominion Energy, their unregulated arm is building in Brownsville, Texas. But it started out as a $500 million vessel. It's up to $650 million for one ship. So, they're not cheap to build in the US. That same ship, you build it somewhere in Southeast Asia, you can build it for less than half the cost.
It's a great illustrative example, and thanks for explaining it so cleanly, of this tension between domestic economic development, industrial policy, and onshoring, and the need for rapid energy transitions. I want to shift to you, Mandy. As we shop for the new car, to what extent should we prioritize minimizing costs versus building resilient distributed systems. And where do those two factors come into tension with one another, if they do at all? And how do we deal with that?
So where this comes in the transmission policy space is, do we need a gold-plated system, or do we just need it to work? And there's a balance there to be struck, and I would probably say we don't need the gold plate, but we do need it probably more than average, because we need it to last a long time. If you think about when the current grid that we're operating on was built 60, 70, 80 years ago, there was a significant investment, but it's lasted us 60, 70, 80. I mean, there's parts in the Northeast in PJM that are 100 years old that are still running, and they're still running it. If we can get that kind of quality again, that sets us up for the grid 2.0 and the energy transition. And unfortunately, we just come at a time where, the 3 generations ago, they paid for it, and now we're sitting here and we have to figure out how to pay for this set. And 3 generations from now are gonna have to figure out, what do we do with grid 3.0? I think that's where, where the tension lies is how do we pay for it, and how, because everybody's budget is different, and we can't assume that low to middle income ratepayers can afford the same as the wealthy oceanfront house owners, and that's what regulators and legislators have to balance.
Thanks. Sandra, we have a question that wants a bit more color on the housing market. It says, we've heard an estimate of $60,000 to $70,000 given for decarbonizing a housing unit. So can you unpack a bit more about what's in there and how we might get that paid for?
Sure. So what's in there? Weatherization, which means we are insulating the home based on whatever region you live in. In the Midwest, it's R16, which is a unit of insulation for walls. R40 in the ceiling to take care of the roof. That's non-negotiable. It means doing all the efficient things that we can do very easily, lighting, all of those things. So, but the main thing is to make sure the envelope is tight, as tight as possible when we talk about efficiency. And then the next step would be to look at their heating and cooling equipment. And ideally, in the world of electrification, you want to take it out and put in a heat pump for heating and cooling. You want to put in a heat pump for domestic hot water, if at all possible. And potentially a heat pump dryer, which is on the market today. So let's talk about affordability for a second. So if you're talking about getting a home to some level of electrification, you got to weatherize, you got to make it tight, and you look at the HVAC system and probably how they're cooking. You'd want to take out the gas appliance and put in induction or electric resistance. And those elements, probably the most expensive thing to do for labor is the weatherization. And that's where the costs start to creep up. Because I guess in my world, the last thing you want to do is attach renewable energy to a building that's not performing well. So the goal is to make it perform well before you put on the renewable energy. And that's where the cost comes in. It's the labor to weatherize, it's the labor to remove the HVAC equipment and put in the heat pump. It's the labor to assess the home, to figure out what the scope of work will be. It's labor intensive, and that's how you get to $60,000 to $70,000 per housing unit. And that could vary depending on where you live. And that cost could also be, mediated by policy. Like if we had a policy that said, here are the minimum things you're going to do to have an energy efficient home, that's a policy that we can write. Mm-hmm. And that could help address some of the costs related to that.
Thank you. And again, another nod to smart sequencing of how we're organizing our policies and our finance and our operations. We're at time, but Raul, I want to give one final question to you. We've talked a lot about supply chains, but we haven't talked that much about extraction and processing of the minerals that we need as inputs into the energy transition. And of course, much of that is going to be taking place in low and middle income countries around the world. What sort of principles, policies, approaches can exist at international levels and at country levels to help protect the human rights of those that are going to be involved in that extraction?
Yeah, so another complex question to wrap up the panel, but I think it really speaks to something that really I think we need to keep in mind. I mean, you talk about principles and policies, and I'm just thinking about values like, you know, the African Ubuntu value of community, right? Because, you know, just like was discussed just now, you really cannot do everything at home. You really need materials from elsewhere. You need something from outside of your country, and that's okay, because otherwise it's going to be more expensive, more. So thinking about a principal community, you know, we are a global community. In fact, the truth is most of those rare materials are in 3 or 4 or 5 places. So Congo, Chile, you know, Indonesia. So how do you want to approach those countries is a key question, right? And I think, you know, we've tried many things which have failed, you know, including wars or trade wars even. That doesn't work. So I think maybe take out the war and keep on trade and thinking about, you know, how can we really be a global community that actually finds common benefit for something that we all need. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I keep in mind.
And you know, I think it brings up too, and we talk about some of the shifts in the supply chains that we see, part of that will be that we won't see so much just raw ore extraction from some of these countries. Indonesia is a good example where the US and others are investing in nickel smelting and processing there that can give the country more value, can improve those processes, and can help supply the material needs for the energy transition here. Thank you all for such an insightful and holistic panel. Please join me in thanking our panel members.